With almost all of those acts of the New Deal, both the first and second New Deal, in place by 1935, FDR rose to heights of popularity unprecedented in the history of the American presidency. He was enormously popular with the American people, and as I've described to you, they felt an attachment to him unlike any other president. This is punctuated in some ways by things like his fireside chats, informal, warm, and friendly radio addresses that he delivered each week, and tens of millions of people crowded around their radios every week to listen to his fireside chats. In one of those fireside chats, he told Americans to tell me your troubles. And within a week, the White House had received more than 450,000 letters, many of which FDR read and responded to personally, and tens of thousands of which were ultimately replied to by members of his staff. So it is this wave of popularity that he is going to ride into the 1936 presidential election, which, as you can judge by the map on your screen, is one of the most sweeping landslide victories in our nation's history. And frankly, I think you have to go back to the very first elections of George Washington to find unanimous results that would top this election. It is in this election that we see what comes to be known as the Roosevelt Coalition at work. It would almost seem that the Roosevelt Coalition consists of everyone, but it is essentially those people who are benefiting most from the programs of the New Deal: the urban masses, industrial workers, minorities and ethnic groups, farmers, African Americans, middle-class homeowners, this powerful coalition that comes together. And you notice in terms of geography, other than two of the farthest north states in New England, it connects the entire country. So you don't have some of the situation like we have today, in which the South, for instance, tends to vote largely one way. The middle part of the country votes one way. In this election, it was the entire country. His opponent was Alfred Landon of Kansas. That's essentially a note of trivia. Landon really had nowhere to run in this election. You weren't going to gain much traction running against the New Deal or in opposition to the New Deal, and so Landon really was without hope in this election. And so we see the popular vote for FDR, 28 million to 17 million, but it is really the electoral vote that stands out, 523 to 8. And so this is once again a sweeping mandate, a sweeping endorsement of FDR, the New Deal, and the way he's been doing things. And so he rides in for his second term with almost unprecedented support from the American people. But FDR recognized that there was still more to be done. We were still in the midst of the Great Depression. In his second inaugural address, FDR uttered the famous phrase, "I see 1/3 of a nation ill-housed, ill-clad, ill-nourished." And so FDR still perceived that he had a long way to go. Beginning with the next slide and carrying through to the end of these lectures, we'll discuss what kinds of things FDR hoped and intended to do in that second term and beyond. So what would FDR do with this unprecedented popularity and support from the American people? In essence, he squandered it. At the heights of his power, he attempted to address the one branch of government that had been giving him problems and had not gone along with his program, the Supreme Court. FDR proposed what has come to be known as the court-packing plan shortly after his re-election in 1936. It would mark his first major defeat or setback, and would actually begin to precipitate a slide in his popularity. And so we can look back and say that never again would FDR approach the heights of popularity as he reached in that 1936 election. Well, let me just remind you what FDR's issue was in terms of the Supreme Court. They had overturned a number of the signature acts of the first New Deal. The Schechter versus U.S. court case overturned the NIRA. The U.S. versus Butler case had overturned the AAA. And so FDR developed a powerful dislike and disdain for what he referred to as those 9 old men, 4 of which in particular he referred to as the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. These were arch conservatives, Republicans, who had been appointed years before. So before we get into the plan itself and the outcome of this, I need to describe a little bit about the nature of the court in case you are not familiar with it. There are 9 members of the Supreme Court. There had not always been 9 members of the court. In fact, the Constitution originally called for 6 justices on the court. That had been changed a couple of different times, so it was not unprecedented to change the number of the justices on the court. And I would also note that in terms of the politics of the court and the members who were giving FDR problems, there were only 4 who were these arch conservatives, staunch Republicans who just on a political basis were likely to oppose anything that FDR and the New Deal did. Well, that meant that the other 5 were at least open to suggestion. There were 3 liberal members of the court, and then there were 2 sort of swing votes, people in the middle. And so what we've seen with the Schechter case and the Butler case and a couple of other cases was that at least one of those swing votes, and sometimes more, voted against the New Deal Act. But as I described to you, there were technicalities, there were questions about the constitutionality of those laws. It was not purely just a political objection. So FDR would not have to replace the entire court to fix his problem. Just a few members would have made things better. So with that background, this is the plan that FDR developed. He noted that many members of the court were getting up in years. In fact, 6 of them were over the age of 70. He also commented that there was a great backlog of cases. It was taking months and months for cases to clear through the Supreme Court. And that was certainly true. So the plan he proposed was that for each justice over the age of 70, and again, at that time it would have been 6, FDR would be allowed to appoint a new justice or an additional justice who would then help the court in general to kind of get through this backlog of court cases. That was the case that he presented to the American people. Unfortunately, FDR's true intentions, which essentially was to bring the court around to support him, were pretty transparent to everyone in Washington and to the American people as well. Who would FDR appoint if he had the opportunity? Well, I think the cartoon on the right puts it pretty well, and I like this cartoon. Who are the 6 new justices that FDR appoints to help the members of the court? Well, it's him over and over again. He's appointing himself. In essence, he's going to appoint people who will support his views. Well, much to FDR's disappointment and dismay, despite his enormous popularity and the fact that he's just been reelected and he has huge majorities in both houses of Congress, he finds that he has many opponents to this proposal. And in fact, many members of his own party oppose him on this point. What kinds of things did they point out? Well, one of the objections was that, indeed, this would make FDR too powerful. He already controls the executive branch. He's got sweeping majorities across the legislative branch, and this would give him a firm stranglehold on the courts as well. So, again, why have separation of powers at all? Why have the 3 branches of government? He would be like a dictator. The other objection, though, and this came from many members of his own party, was that he had not discussed this previously with members of Congress. He hadn't really drawn up the plan with the support of many of these people. He simply presented it to the country in one of his fireside chats. And many members of Congress heard about the plan in the same chat that the American people heard about it. And many of them objected to that. They wanted to be brought along. They wanted to be informed and asked and part of the process. And so the court packing plan did not pass through Congress. It was defeated. This was, as I said, FDR's first major setback. However, it is often described in the textbooks under the cliche of losing the battle but winning the war. Indeed, FDR loses this battle. But what is the war? What is the bigger picture here? So we need to kind of pull back our scope and think again in broadest terms. What FDR really wanted was for his acts to be upheld by the court. He didn't want Social Security to be overturned like the NIRA had. He didn't want the Wagner Act to be voted down like the AAA had. So he didn't really care how that happened. He didn't really care if he had to appoint new members of the court or not. He simply wanted his acts to be upheld. And in fact, that is what happened. The Social Security Act, the Wagner Act, and others, when they came up for consideration, were not voted down by the courts. Again, just bear in mind that those earlier acts, there were problems. There were technicalities. The other thing to note about this, and it's an interesting note in many of your textbooks, is that while FDR did not see his court packing plan pass, it wasn't long before he was able to appoint several justices of his own, and before his presidency was over, he appointed more justices than any other president, 9 justices to the Supreme Court, virtually replacing the entire court. The failure of the court packing plan was the first major setback, the first major disappointment of FDR's presidency. But it wasn't the last, and in fact it was only one of a string of disappointments during his second term that point to one of the initial questions that I raised when we talk about FDR, the fact that he wins the presidential election 4 times, and why is that so difficult to do, and why hasn't anyone else done it? Second terms tend to be difficult. Scandals arise. Things happen in second terms, and we need go back only through our fairly recent history of 2-term presidents like Obama, like George Bush, like Bill Clinton. In each case, and there are many others as well, but in each case we see the popularity of these presidents in their first term. They're able to win re-election, in some cases sweeping victories in their re-election, and yet things happen in that second term. Things go awry. And that's true of FDR as well. So, the court packing plan was the first. There were several others. Among them were a series of labor clashes that swept the country in 1937. We see many, many instances of workers going out on strike, and many of these clashes ending in violence. Well, what does this have to do with the president? First of all, well, many people would say it's his policies that led to this. It was under his endorsement that the Wagner Act went into place, guaranteeing the right of workers to form unions, guaranteeing their right to go on strike. So what do? They form unions. They go on strike. This is exactly what he expected or asked them to do. The most severe of these came on Memorial Day in 1937. There were several different strikes that day all around the country, but in Chicago, steel workers who were out on strike found themselves victims of what came to be called the Memorial Day Massacre. You see at the bottom there a newsreel shot from that event. These steel workers were out on strike. They were walking. They were met by a group of police. Shoving or scuffling broke out on the front line, and then the police began firing into the crowd. And you see, that's the moment you see the workers running away. 10 people were killed, many others wounded in this attack. And as I've mentioned to you, it was only one of many instances of violence in the country. At the top, you see another example of a worker being attacked. This one involved workers at the Ford Motor Company, which had once been the standard bearer for fair wages and conditions. This was a place that workers had been proud to work. But the Ford Motor Company had not raised wages in many, many years. And so even at this once acclaimed industry, there were clashes. And again, in some ways, this comes back to the president. Another setback that befalls FDR in his second term was that he was beginning to lose his grasp on the South. And it's in this era that we begin to see the South starting to vote Republican in greater numbers. And eventually the South is going to slip away from the Democratic Party altogether. This is evidenced in the 1938 midterm elections, when FDR campaigned in the South. As presidents always do in those midterm elections, you put your hand on someone's shoulder, you make speeches on their behalf, and hope that that your support puts them over the top. Well, this is FDR, the most popular president in our nation's history, who in 1936 won that huge landslide election. In 1938, he traveled the South supporting 9 different candidates in those elections, and each of them lost those elections. So we see in a relatively short period of time his coattails losing their effect. Historians debate the reasons for this. There are a couple of things we might point to. One theory is that Southerners began to feel like they didn't need the New Deal anymore. The economy was recovering, agriculture was doing better, the South seemed to be bouncing back from the Great Depression, and so they just didn't need the acts of the New Deal. Other historians argue, and perhaps this is a more convincing argument, that it was FDR's support of and popularity with African Americans that drove white Southerners away from the Democratic Party. FDR and Eleanor Roosevelt, we should point out, was extremely popular with blacks. And the more it seemed that FDR and Eleanor Roosevelt were appealing to blacks, the more white Southerners grew frustrated with that. Whatever the reasons, the 1938 midterm elections see the tide beginning to swing back toward the Republicans, and particularly in the South, Democrats are losing their grip. A final blow to the FDR administration in his second term is what is known as the Roosevelt Recession. In essence, the Roosevelt Recession is a worsening or a deepening of the Great Depression again. We had seen for about 5 years steady improvement in the economy and the situation. And suddenly, at the end of 1937 and into 1938, the economy takes a turn for the worse once again. Well, is this really the fault of the president? As I mentioned to you earlier, the economy is such a difficult thing to predict and such a fickle thing. Can we blame FDR? Well, in some ways we can, and historians and economists do just that. One of the reasons that we think this recession set in is that FDR authorized cuts to the WPA and some of the other public works programs that had employed so many Americans. Hundreds of thousands of workers were laid off by the WPA and some of these other groups. There was also the very heavy Social Security tax that went into place in 1937 and into 1938 to pay for those first beneficiaries of the Social Security program. There were also those labor tensions that I mentioned to you, unsteady employment conditions, many different workers going out on strike, different factories and employers responding harshly to those conditions. And so things are just appearing to grow less certain again. And collectively, the nation responds to this by beginning to panic again, perhaps not quite as severely as they had back in 1929 and 1930, but the same mindset. Remember, we all remember the stock market crash of 1929. This is only 6 or 7 years later, and so people are fairly quick to pull their money out of the stock market and start putting it under the mattress again. Well, if FDR and his policies are at least somewhat to blame for this recession, we have to credit FDR as well for an equally quick and effective response to this recession. Once it was becoming clear that the country was in fact sliding back into a recession, the government very quickly passed a $5 billion spending bill. And again, this is under the idea of priming the pump of the economy, just keeping the economy going. He also restored the workers who had been laid off. More than 2 million workers brought back onto the WPA and other work programs. FDR also launched attacks against monopolies and sort of mild attacks against big business to try to restore power to consumers and individual workers. And after those initial taxes that were designed to cover the Social Security payments, the federal government cut taxes in 1938 and 1939. And so while we do see this sort of momentary blip on the radar, the Roosevelt Recession, which lasts for about a year, we see just as quickly things are getting back on the right track. And you see that reflected in both of the charts there on the right-hand side. Unemployment there at the top. If you look throughout the middle 1930s, unemployment rates are coming down and coming down. Those are all the acts of the New Deal going into place. But then 1938, it spikes again back to 19.1 before coming back in. That's the Roosevelt Recession. And the same thing at the bottom. This is the stock market. You see the increases of the 1920s, then the crash, now the increase again in the mid-1930s, and then look at 1937, the stock market plunges again there in 1938, just for a brief period. So the Roosevelt Recession, losing the South, the labor clashes of this era, the court-packing scheme. These are all examples of the FDR administration faltering a bit during its second term. So it's not enough for FDR to lose re-election again in 1940, but some of the luster, some of the shine comes off of FDR's presidency during that second term. And so by the end of the 1930s, we can say that the New Deal has come to an end as well. It's difficult to pinpoint an exact date, but many historians look at those elections of 1938 when the Republicans rebound significantly in both houses of Congress. They don't achieve majorities in either house of Congress, but they do rebound from their disappointments of the earlier years. And many historians note that as the end of the New Deal. And we can also observe that almost all of the acts of the New Deal took place by 1935. And so we can look back and reflect on some of the successes and some of the shortcomings of the New Deal. In terms of its limitations or its shortcomings, we've already talked about a number of these examples. It does not help blacks or women equally with white men, and I discussed some of the reasons for that, but nonetheless, it is a shortcoming of the New Deal. The New Deal does not resolve the Great Depression. We are still in the Great Depression by the end of the 1930s. It is the productivity of World War II that ultimately gets us out of the Great Depression. So understand that. It helps with the economy. It gets us back in the right direction, but it does not resolve the Great Depression. And finally, we can look at those labor clashes. We can look at the unstable conditions of 1938, 1939 as examples of some of the shortcomings of the New Deal. At the same time, the New Deal certainly has its successes and leaves an incredibly powerful imprint on our nation and our government and the way we think about things. Certainly, in terms of the economy, we can say that the New Deal did dig us out of the depths of the Great Depression. It's certainly one of those what-if questions that perhaps can't be answered, but we can certainly wonder, what if there had not been a New Deal? Would the nation have simply crumbled into oblivion in 1932 or 1933 without those acts of the New Deal? Perhaps. But we do know that with the New Deal in place, the economy gets back moving in the right direction. Unemployment comes down. The stock market is revived. So it certainly helps with the economy. But we can also look at some of these lasting impacts of the New Deal. One of them is the creation of that Roosevelt Coalition, or the New Deal Coalition. This group would form the core of the Democratic Party up through the 1960s. It certainly plays a great role in the election or re-election of Harry Truman in 1948, which I will talk about in a later lecture. It also leads to the creation of the welfare state, the idea that the federal government will be there to protect us, this idea of cradle-to-the-grave protection. You can agree or disagree whether that's a situation that we should have, but it is a situation that we do have, and many Americans are accustomed to the thought that the federal government will be there to help me when push comes to shove. If I'm in a bad way, the federal government will be there. And finally, we can say that the New Deal and FDR and even the bleak times of the Depression helped to unify the nation. We all came together. I talked about that neighborhood cooperation, people coming together to support each other. And this created a powerful sort of unity within the country that is going to be vital as the nation is plunged into its next crisis, the topic we will discuss in the next chapter, World War II.